we shall look at the Chinese, Roman, British, Muslim and Spanish empires to gain insight into the nature of civilization and the reasons for the collapse of empire. The Roman and Spanish are interesting for the way they collapsed, and the Chinese and Muslim empires for the way they simply got bypassed and made irrelevant. The British Empire was the most extensive of these empires and the most enduring, especially if we consider its colonies an extension of its conservatism. Yet, as enlightened as it may be, the English system and its civilization shows serious signs of collapse. This would matter less if the collapse of Britain did not carry with it the threat of civilization's collapse. Because in many ways, civilization and Britain are tightly interwoven. To understand what is happening, we need to define what we mean by civilization. Most readers assume a civilization is a highly technical society. Civilizations are thought to have advanced science and industry. These attributes of civilization are the result of civilization, not the cause. A people able to civilize has the ability to develop higher levels of technology and science. However, these things, and this goes for the military, have to be paid for. So, we need a source of income equal to the cost of maintaining an advanced civilization. Civilizations have advanced economies, but these also are the results of civilized living, not the cause. To have or attain all of the attributes of civilization, there needs to be a very high-level specialization. The more primitive and backward the society, the more modular it is. There are likely to be various social components, such as elders and leaders in a tribe, but for the most part, each person is able to fill the role or office in the tribe. The only real diversification in tribes is sexual division between women and men, and in slightly higher tribal groupings, the division that exists between the lower and upper social orders. The Chinese are interesting because they held to a very high standard of civilization for many thousands of years, inventing most of the basic technologies of advanced civilizations. But it was a highly stratified society, and there was little social movement. In its structure, its culture was properly considered medieval. The real political power lay with the feudal lords and the Chinese emperor. The warrior class was in decline far earlier than happened elsewhere. But the intelligentsia had great honor, if not direct power. It was possible for the highly educated minister to advance high up in the social order. It was perhaps the only route out of poverty for most of the poor. But China remained inward-looking, even destroying one of the greatest navies ever floated to halt the temptations represented by foreign cultures. But the nation became so stratified it became moribund, and scientific discoveries stopped being made. It entered into what was called in Europe the Dark Ages. The problem was, the internal empire was so big and so troublesome, the empire consumed all of its resources maintaining its internal structure and had nothing left for outward expansion. Eventually, the British and American fleets breached the doors to the kingdom, and it was only the First World War and the Chinese Revolution that put China on a new path to the future. Oddly, China has become a kind of giant industrial complex where profit is king. For some, this new identity may appear strange, but in their undiluted state, communism and libertarianism have a great deal in common. Political power and commercial power merge in globalism. The Roman Empire was quite unlike the Chinese Empire. There are superficial similarities, but the fundamental nature of the two are distinct. The Roman Empire was one of the world's most cosmopolitan and politically liberal, whereas China was ultra-conservative. All cultures, peoples and faiths were welcome in the empire, and there were few offices not open to a devoted citizen of Rome. China was and remains a very closed culture. However, Rome was very much a culture founded on war. China was constantly at war, but they were wars of consolidation or defense, not wars of expansion. Rome's economy relied on the flow of tribute, whereas China relied mostly on taxation. This need for a constant flow of tribute from its provinces and newly acquired territory proved to be its Achilles heel. With the onset of the Black Death, the conflicts over the spoils of war, the need for acquiring new territories and the disputes within the armed forces itself, coupled with the double threat of the Germanic tribes in the west and the Muslims in the east, the vaunted might of the Roman armies was stretched beyond their ability to respond and collapsed. The Muslim Empire, as so happens, came upon the scene at the right place at the right time to exploit the weakness of the East and the West. However, their own problems did not allow them to exploit the problems in the West, to the degree they might have had more modern model been adopted by them. Structurally, the caliphate remains organizationally primitive. The Arab tribes were disorganized in a time when armies were getting larger and tactics more sophisticated. It did not take a lot for a skilled warrior to defeat and amalgamate the city-states and tribal kingdoms of the East. Defeating the West was another matter. Had Rome not become overextended and weakened by the Black Death, Arabia would never have succeeded to the degree it did. While Islam has some successes exploiting the population declines in the West, the gains were not permanent. Heroes such as Vlad the Impaler in the East, Martel the Hammer in the West, King Richard the Lionheart and Ferdinand and Isabella among many others, pushed Islam back to the desert. Similar to the Chinese, Islam had a scientific high point making fundamental discoveries in many fields, but this period died out as Sharia was enforced and military exploits preempted more intellectual pursuits. But even their military conquests slowed to a halt. Islam ceased to adapt their armies to changing times. It was only with the adoption of Christian mercenaries, the Janissaries, that their victories in Europe was made possible. With the end of the Janissaries, the age of Islamic conquest also ended. Ottomans instituted a tax of 1/5 on all slaves taken in war, and from this pool of manpower the sultans first constructed the Janissary Corps as a personal army loyal only to the sultan. The Janissaries were disbanded by Mahmud II on July 16, 1826, by the Ottoman Turks and were formed in 1370 after the fall of Baghdad. In their heyday, the Janissaries served as one of the ruling classes of the Ottoman Empire, rivaling the Turkish aristocracy. The brightest of the Janissaries were sent to be educated. But this only led to them increasing their influence. 750 to 1300 is referred to as the Golden Age of Islam. The rise and fall of Baghdad mirror the rise and fall of the Golden Age of Islam. Baghdad was founded in 762. This was under the Abbasid Caliphate, which interestingly grew to follow the lines of the land given to the Jews by God. The Abbasid Empire fell to the Mongol invasions and the siege of Baghdad in 1258. The fall of Baghdad and the Abbasids gives us the date of 1300 for the ending of the Golden Age. The Spanish Empire was founded almost entirely by colonialism and grew out of the continued conquest that followed from Spain defeating the Umayyad Caliphate. The Islamic conquest of Spain lasted from 711-1492 when Granada was retaken. Muslim forces attempted to move northeast across the Pyrenees Mountains toward France but were defeated by the Frankish Christian Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732. Queen Isabella I of Castile and her husband King Ferdinand II of Aragon defeated the last of the Muslim armies in 1492, the date that Columbus, under their patronage, discovered America. This year also heralds the Age of Discovery. It was an era in which Spain made the greatest gains. Beginning in 1492 and ending sometime in the late 1600s. But the real end probably can be dated at 1588 and the loss of the Spanish Armada to Britain's navy in the time of Elizabeth I. Spain's colonies were primarily in South America, but Spain also controlled much of Morocco and had a claim on the Netherlands or what were known as the Low Countries. Spain's fortunes relied largely on the Podesta mines and the gold of Middle America. However, this reliance on plunder turned Spain into the model colonial state, living off of the spoils of war. The major contribution of the Spanish Empire was it catapulted Britain towards an industrialized state. It may even have helped push Britain towards a more productive and enlightened model of empire. We are not sure of ways to interpret the events of this world. People and culture can be looked at in innumerable ways. We argue here, however, that there is only one biblical way to divide people up. The Bible tells us there are two groups of persons. There are those of the flesh and those of the spirit. But this is confusing for most of us because people do not get the difference. A better way of describing the two groups might be to define them as people who live by the law and those who live by faith. But if this still does not clarify the line and the distinction, think of it as a division between freeloaders and intentionalists. This last paradigm may not seem as biblical as the earlier forms, but most persons find it easier to understand. A freeloader does not pay the costs he or she creates. The freeloader will have good reasons or rationalizations for that. BLM, Marxists, liberals, socialists, governments, and virtually everyone else has a good reason why the world owes them something or even a living. Only the world owes no one anything, nor can it be forced to give anyone anything. The world will watch children starve. It is impassive because the world is not human. But human beings, because they do care, can be ripped off, conned, intimidated, stolen from, and so on. The freeloader steals from the intentionalist. Intentionalists live an intentional, thus non-invasive life. They control, hence they are not dominated by their emotions in the way liberals are. The point of this discussion is to get us to look at these earlier empires as invasive life forms. This is not to say Britain was not a nation that never took without buying. Britain, like other empire builders, practiced a lot of things that were invasive and legalistic, but it was the first nation or people to attempt to lessen their dependency on others. They systematically frowned upon the parasitic life. There were parasites in Britain, but these were normally shunned and often sent to the colonies away from decent society. Landowners, the gentry, and politicians were all forced to at least look as if they served a purpose. It was in Britain that capitalism replaced mercantilism, a way of life that brought down Spain. Britain took tribute from its colonies, but more than any other empire it attempted to make its colonies self-reliant. The British colonies did not exist, according to the British Foreign Service, for the purpose of enriching the mother country. This new attitude was partly due to the adoption of capitalist rhetoric and partly to the influence of Christianity. Rome, Islam, China, and Spain, each in their own way, focused on rationalizing graft. Indeed, power was viewed as a license to steal. One obtained to an office to enrich oneself. It is still a common practice in many places, but England created a professional bureaucracy and army. These were trained and paid professionals that took pride in their work. This position can be argued against. There were exceptions. But even the move from mercantilism to capitalism expressed a general trend towards professionalism and a merit-based system. One was promoted based on objective standards, not on the orders of a criminal conspirator. This is not to say capitalists did not benefit from their investments in foreign lands. It is not being argued that some professional bureaucrats nor did not exploit their position to the utmost. Evil finds a way. But the behavior of England did not have to be perfect for it to gain an edge over its rivals. Britain only needed to be an improvement on what came before and those with whom it competed against. Rome and Spain collapsed because they were built on a house of cards, defined as a mercurial military might. Rome turned into something of a Ponzi scheme. So long as it could conquer a people, then promise its warriors wealth and power for the victory, joining the army seemed to give the average Roman and its colonies unlimited opportunities. This pyramid scheme could have gone on longer had Western Europe been as advanced as the Mediterranean basin. The problem was, once Rome entered Britain, Galicia and Germania, the costs of the campaigns far outweighed any possible benefits. These were still relatively primitive regions. Rome, to these Western barbarians, represented unimaginable booty, but they had nothing to offer Rome but an allegiance they were not willing to give. Spain easily turned military conquest into wealth with very little cost or risk. The opposition to their armies was minimal. But military power did not increase vis-a-vis its main competitors, which were not in South America, but in Europe. The ease of its victories in its colonies made it ill-prepared for a war with Britain. The plunder of Spain made it a magnet for pirates and covert operations conducted by other nations, most notably Britain. Its gold could not purchase the military power it needed. People wanted to live in leisure, not engage in foreign wars. After an ill-advised all-or-nothing attack against the greatest navy of the time, Britain, Spain lapsed into something akin to a third-world country, for some time. Spain was like a slum landlord whose property had been condemned. They had the glamour of an empire without the income. China and Islam faced an internal dilemma neither recognized nor could overcome. China became highly stratified. There was some social movement, but what there was, existed only to ensure stability. Its bureaucracy was committed on maintaining the status quo at any cost. Had it been the only nation on earth, it might have been an eternal kingdom. But things were changing in dramatic ways outside of his sphere of influence, and these modifications to technology would soon intrude into its sphere of influence. As was so often the case, the fall was arranged through the agency of Britain's navy. Islam had initially borrowed from Rome's playbook. Its warriors paid for Islam's conquest with their numerous victories. It also got into a place where the victories, if they happened, were not able to pay the costs of the campaign. As they got further into Europe, victories were harder won and defeats more frequent and costly. As the West was learning how to deal with the threat of Islam, Islam was discovering the lesson Rome had learned. As with the case with Spain, its significant early victories brought its people a wealth that tended to weaken its desire to engage in risky ventures. The reticence to fight was countered, at least in Turkey, with the adoption of slave armies made up of Christians. This ploy led to a resurgence of Islam, but at considerable cost to the realm. As was the case with Rome, Islam ended up with a very powerful army of mercenaries devoted to gaining greater wealth and power for themselves. This put the army at odds with the aims of the caliphate. Eventually the Janissaries were destroyed, but with the loss of their best fighting force, went all hopes of Islamic empire building by means of martial valor. Without the wealth needed to fund expansive military operations or the men with the desire to promote the empire, the caliphate became moribund. The Second World War put the Arab states so far behind the West militarily, war was no longer even an option. A fact driven home time and time again by their losses against the tiny state of Israel. War has become an expensive option with next to no benefit. War is no longer a builder of empires but has become a destroyer of them. Britain avoided dependency on war and colonization despite the size and success of their military. Even while they remained a highly stratified society, public office did not come with inalienable rights. One might be a governor of a colony, but it was a job with a paycheck and a job description. Public office ceased to be a license to steal. Even the prince and other nobles had to earn their pay and justify their position, or at least make a show of being useful. There was not the internal animosity in Britain, as arose elsewhere. Despite the stratification, each layer felt the others were playing a role in the empire. The lesson of Britain is that no matter how powerful one is, nationally or individually, a person in a nation must add value to the Commonwealth. To a large degree, Britain introduced the idea of a meritocracy. It was largely informal, yet it was a lesson that was internalized to a degree not seen elsewhere. The wise ruler, nation and people will minimize freeloading as much as possible. People needed to be rewarded based on merit, not on popularity. Power must not have its rewards, especially when these rewards ought to go to another who has greater merit. What one gets must be earned, no matter the position held. The importance of rewarding merit rather than power or popularity is the lesson we learn from Britain.